My name is James Studer. I've been working in Dynamics for close to a decade now, primarily from a techno-functional type standpoint. I spend a lot of my time in the actual code and doing a lot of complex integrations with the Dynamics and the Common Data Service platform and all that. So what I'm going to be talking about today is how we can utilize Azure Pipelines to standardize our deployments. And this whole thing I was on an engagement directly with Microsoft, and they wanted a way to be able to deploy solutions the same way between all the instances, know who made changes, when changes were made, and they wanted to set up a whole approval process for that way you couldn't just take a solution out of dev and stick it directly into production without anybody knowing about it. So I sat down, and it took me quite a while to figure it out, but I did figure out how to use PowerShell and a couple other tools to create this pipeline and basically automate somewhat automate the process. And it actually did come very useful. We did have a solution get out of sync, and we didn't find it until, unfortunately, things did make it into our UAT instance. But using the pipelines, we were able to backtrack the releases and find where it occurred and why it occurred. And then we were able to fix it. For anybody interested, I do have a blog. I am working, trying to work towards getting my MVP status. So I do try to, any things that aren't like customer proprietary and stuff like that, just kind of gotchas and all that, I try to document on my blog instead of just, keeping it all private and everything. I do have a plan to write out a couple blog posts on how to do this pipeline stuff. So we're just going to do a quick overview of Azure Pipelines. We're going to discuss there is a difference between build and release pipelines. We're going to look at how we can use Git as part of to push our files back into our repo, and that's predominantly around when we're trying to back up our solutions and stuff like that. How we can utilize PowerShell. And then one of the tools that I became familiar with was the Power DevOps tools. And Microsoft actually has a very similar tool now that does pretty much the exact same thing. And I'll show you both of those tools inside of Azure Pipelines. So the Azure Pipelines, this is where we get into like setting up our CICD, our continuous integration and continuous delivery. You see this a lot with like web apps and stuff like that, where we can make little tiny tweaks to it, and then we send the code through a pipeline, and it'll test it, make sure our little change we made doesn't break anything, and then if it passes all of that, it compiles everything and puts it into a release that can then be pushed out into production. So it's just, we do a lot of routine things, with Dynamics when it comes to migrating our solutions, with having to hit the export button, download the file, then, re-import it. And I've had issues before where it's like on a laptop or something on a very large solution, it would time out and everything. So it's just another way to help alleviate those issues that we see, because we're offloading it off of what would be, an on-premise tool such as a laptop or a desktop and stuff up to the cloud and letting it handle it for us. With this, I'm one as a coder, I really like tests. It's not uncommon for like a plugin that I write to have 50, 60, 70 unit tests on it to make sure everything I'm writing is working as intended. And this is the nice thing too, is with these pipelines is you can run all of those tests automatically. So that way, if you are working on a large team, and that Microsoft one that I mentioned, we had 2 different consulting firms, and I think we were about 15 or 20 individuals on that project that were, multiple code check-ins and all that. So it was a way of making sure we all were doing the things the same way. So typically, with the pipelines, you start off in an IDE such as Visual Studio or VS Code. As a developer working in Dynamics, I tend to view Dynamics almost as an IDE of a sense, because that's where we're creating all of our forms, our views, our fields. It's, I guess, a more user-friendly as SSMS in a way, since we are working with a SQL database backend and all that. So, that's where the blue icon here, which is for VS Code, where all that is. And then you have your repo, which you can do Git or TFS. I prefer to do Git. It's a lot easier to work with inside of the pipelines. And then in our continuous integration part, that's our build pipeline. That's what's going to take and actually, get our solutions, increase our version number, and all that. This is where we're going to do all of our building and testing and all that stuff. And I've done build pipelines just to back up stuff. That all it does is I run the pipeline and it backs up everything into my repo, and that's it. There is no release tied to it. But then if we want to move those solutions to another instance, that's where our release pipeline comes in, which is our continuous deployment. And that's where we set up the approvals and everything. And then once that runs, it pushes everything into the environments that we specify. The way that this was, when I was first learning about this, the way it was explained to me is if you think of it as a train, you start off at a train station and you kind of, you go station to station to station. Now, you may not stop at every single station, or, there might be 10 stations and, that train, you may stop at station 5. But the next time it runs, you might stop at station 8. So just because, like in a build pipe or in a release pipeline, if you have, like I had mentioned, the 4 instances, so we had a release into 3 of the instances, that release may stop at the UAT instance and not make it into production, or you could have it stop in the test instance. So it's just, just because it shows in the release to go from dev all the way to production, it doesn't have to go that full length. So just like I said, that was just real quick, high level overview. Most of what we're going to be doing is all the, the demo and walkthrough stuff. We will look at, there is a version 1 and version 2 of the pipelines. The main difference between them is just the UI. You'll see the version 1 UI when we walk through the release pipeline. The version 2 UI you'll see when we're doing the build pipelines. As a developer, I prefer the version 2 working with the YAML file directly because I can make changes inside of VS Code to the pipeline. We'll look at, there's one main Git script that I wanted to highlight. It took me a couple hours to figure it out and a couple of calls with people, but it's using Git diff to actually check to see what was actually changed. So we only publish the stuff that we want that's changed. And then we'll look at the different tools, exporting, importing solutions, migrating configuration data, show you how variables work so that way you can securely store your connection strings. And then versioning. This is the real thing I really like with the pipelines is now, I'm sure a lot of us have logged into Dynamics instances and you see the solutions and they're all 1.0.0.0. Now with this, we can automate our version and we can look at it. If you use just the out-of-the-box version number that comes with pipelines, it'll have the date, period, and then whatever the build number was for that day. So if it was like your 7th build, we know the day and then, how many times that solution has been published. So any questions up to that point in the chat? I know I went kind of fast on that. See anything there?
No questions in the chat yet, but anyone can ask live too.
Anybody have anything before we jump into this? All right. So I have VS Code. And can you guys read these? Okay. I got it zoomed into about 150%. Cool. All right. So I've got my VS Code here, and I've already got a repo that is set up. And as you can see down at the bottom, we're just working off the master branch. You can do, and I recommend it when you're doing releases, especially on a bigger team. You can do branches for like each release. So that way, that's another way of isolating your changes and everything. But for this, we're just going to work off of our master branch here. And right now, we just have our pipelines folder, our git ignore, and just the README file that was used to initialize the repo. And in here, as developers, you know, we need the SDK. So this is actually one of, if you're not familiar with how to do the PowerShell and stuff, this is a good way to kind of start with it. Is on the D365 tools folder that I have in the pipelines. These are all of the tools from the SDK. And to get those, Microsoft provides us with a script already. I've kind of just tweaked it a little bit to place it in the correct folders. But I like having the SDK inside of our pipelines folder because one, some of the pipelines do need it. And also, it allows all of your developers and stuff to be working off the same SDK instead of me having one version downloaded locally and another developer, another one, and all that. We can update our tools and use them all inside that repo. So if I just run this, it would update, you know, all of these. So that's a nice, easy way to kind of get into PowerShell. From there, then we have the PowerShell tools. And I've got some example scripts we're going to go over. But I have my pipeline scripts. These are scripts that are called directly from the pipelines themselves. So I don't actually run these inside of VS Code at all. And then we have our, you know, the Git D365 tools. And then this is the script as a developer that I would run locally. That's going to kick off the whole pipeline process. And then we have our actual pipeline here. So this is, for anybody that hasn't seen YAML before, this is a YAML file. This is how, with pipelines, you want to specify a trigger. Or you can have it run on a schedule if you wanted to. If you want to do like a nightly build, you can set up a build pipeline that runs on a schedule to run and do your build. In this case, this pipeline runs anytime there's a change to the master branch, it's going to run unless that change is in our pipelines folder. Because if I make a change into this YAML file and I publish it up, I don't want my pipeline to run and, you know, package up solutions and push them to the release. So by just specifying, you can exclude branches if you have multiple branches. But this one, you know, I specify a path and just tell it, hey, if there's anything in this pipeline folder that changed, ignore it. And I can go as far as just saying, only run if there's changes in this solutions folder. And if you've noticed, there is no solution folder here yet, and I'll show you how that will get created automatically. Our pool, this is going to be the VM that our pipeline runs on. One thing I will note is when you first spin these up, if you're starting from a blank one, is the pool will default to Win-latest. I recommend changing that to the VS 2017 Win 2016. The reason for that is I ran into an issue where a pipeline I built was running just fine, and one day it stopped, and it was Microsoft had pushed an update that had broke running PowerShell scripts on the latest version. So the workaround was to drop back to this version. So I dropped back, and then everything was working just fine. So this is just kind of our setup. You know, when do I need to run? What do I need to ignore? And what am I going to run on? And now we have our steps. So this is actually, you know, the scripts, the script that I want it to go in the order. So the first thing it's going to do is it's going to check out the master branch that it's running on. The persist credentials, this is how it can gain access into variables and all that, and can also interact with our repo. There's more setup than just setting a flag. There's some security that you have to set up inside of DevOps to allow it to access that stuff. But even if you set that up, it still won't connect and run unless you persist the credentials. And then I do a...
Hey, James.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. Would you mind making your text a little larger? It's a little difficult to see. Awesome. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Resizes. There we go. And then the first thing we're going to do in this one, this is the build pipeline you're going to see actually run here in a little bit, is we set up a script, and this script is going to run, and these are just some Git commands. It's going to set up our config. And this doesn't have to be an actual email address. There are some security rules you can set to double check the email to make sure it's legit. But I typically set up a dummy one for the automation part. And the username, whatever the pipeline name is or whatever. And then we go ahead and we do a checkout and a pull against our master branch. These display names, and I'll show you in the logging, this is how this step will appear in the log. So it'll say Git setup master. You have to do this at the beginning, otherwise you won't be able to publish your changes back into the branch. So after that, we're going to run a PowerShell task, and we tell it, so there's a bunch of variables out of the box that you get that you can pass. This is how we're going to get our version number, set up your artifacts, and all that stuff. So we're going to look at our source directory. This is where everything in our master branch has been placed in our VM. And we're going to tell it to go into our pipelines folder, and we're going to run our update version PowerShell script. And that script takes one argument, our build number. So we're going to pass it in our build number that our pipeline has. So all this does is this is going to run that PowerShell script. So once that's done, we have another Git script that we're going to run, and we're going to add everything into it, and we're going to commit it with a message of CI skip version update. So when we look at our commit message, we know that the version number was automatically updated via our pipeline. This CI skip, this is a tag that you can put inside of your message, and this basically tells the pipeline, hey, just ignore this commit. I don't want you to do anything, because all this can do is, if we didn't have that in there, this is just going to keep looping over and keep running. So this is basically how we break our loop then from running again. And we're just going to push our changes back into our repo. So once we've done that, all we've done at this point is just update our version number. So now we need to copy some files. So we're going to take our source directory, which is where all of our code is, that our pipeline's running on, and we're going to copy it over into our artifact staging directory. So what this is going to do is it's going to place all those files there, so it's prepped and ready for our next step, which will actually take that and it's going to build our artifacts, and it's going to call that artifact our release. This artifact, when this is built, that is the stage that kicks off our release pipeline. And that I'll show you directly in Azure DevOps. So once that's done, that's it on our build. That's all we're doing with this build, just to kind of keep it simple, is we're just mainly updating our version number, building our artifacts, and sending it for our release to be pushed into our next environment, whether that's test, UAT, or production. So to do that, and the way this looks then is when we're in Azure DevOps, we have our repos, and if we come down to our pipelines, we can see here's our solution build pipeline. This is the one that we're looking at, and I can just click edit, and here it is, directly in here. And if I want to change any of these, I can come in here and just directly edit it here, or I can click on this settings and it loads it over here in a nice UI where, I can change things directly in here. And some things in here. So our triggers and everything, like I said, it's all managed through the YAML. One thing I will note is to change the name of this, you do have to come and click the ellipsis and go to triggers. And then the name is editable. Outside of there, the only other thing you might use in here are variables or variable groups. But everything else is done through the YAML file when you use a V2. If you were using V1, this is where you would do everything. So this is the V1 interface here, and you can set your stages. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to say that, hey, I'm done. You know, I've made my changes in Dynamics. I'm ready to move my solution. So I go to my D365 script. And one thing to note is you will want to be running VS Code as admin. I'm just preferring to use VS Code, and that's how I've set up these scripts. And all I'm going to do is hit run. So we can see that the PowerShell script is running, and we're going to start seeing some outputs here at the bottom. So we're installing the libraries that we need. And we have our pop-up here, just like anybody that's done any stuff with Dynamics programmatically, I'm sure we're familiar with this pop-up. So I'm going to go ahead and log in to my demo instance. And if you have multiple instances, you can check the box and have it and pick the instance you want to connect to. But what this script does, and I'll show you all this, is it's got a fetch XML that goes and gets all of any unmanaged solutions in the instance that were not created by the system user. So in this case, I have a pipeline demo solution that was created by me. And the way I've set this up and we'll walk through the script is you could choose multiple ones if you wanted to. In this case, we're just dealing with one. So I'm going to choose that one and click OK. And what this is doing is this is going to download the solution onto my desktop, and then it's going to unpack it. So that way I have an unpacked version. I have all the XML, all the mockups, everything is unpacked and in source control. And we can see it's downloaded it, it's extracted it. And if you look over here, I now have 19 new items that I need to check into source control. So for anybody that hasn't seen what an unpacked solution looks like, we now have this solutions folder. We have a downloaded folder. So this is the actual solution file that was downloaded. And it doesn't have the version number on the end of it because I've chosen to ignore that. I just called it pipeline-demo.zip. And this is light gray because this will not get uploaded into our repo because I don't need the zip file. I have it all right here and it's all unpacked. So I can come in here and I can see, the entities that are in there. And I can see like the solution level. We can see, our version number is 1.0.0. So I have all the solution right there unpacked. So now I just want to check this in. Solution backup. So we're just going to give it a quick little message. So now I'm ready. Okay. So we can see we're sending one up to the Azure right now. There we go. So now if I come back over to my repo, we can see I now have a solutions folder here. And then if I go over to my pipelines, I can see a little clock here. So this pipeline, because I've just published that solution directly into our repo, our build pipeline is now running. And what's cool is I can come in here and I can click on job, and we can see here as it's going through what stage it's in. And this is actually just taking the solution and it's re-pushing it into the original instance it came out of. But if we walk through this, we can actually see, it's done a checkout, and we can go through and see, as it's going, what it's doing. We set up our master, so we made sure we're on the master branch. Here we can see that it's working with the solutions folder, the pipeline demo solution, and it's going to go update our version number. And we can see the version number that it's updated to. And then here's where we're pushing it. So it's pushing one file change back, which would be our, that one file that's being pushed back is going to be our XML that has the change. Here we can see all the files it's copying to stage for our build. And then we can see our publish of our artifacts here. So now we can see this is done. And then this is where also if you had tests running and all that, it would fail. And we can see here this one failed because it ran and there wasn't anything that it could do. This is just a dummy one that was set up. So now if I actually go ahead and sync my repo again, you can see here the version number just updated. And the reason it did that is because it updated it in PowerShell and pushed it back to our repo. And then if we go to our solutions here, we can see right now our solution is 1.0.0. But if I refresh, this version number updates. The release is still running. Okay. So what's going on now is we've just built it. Now our release is running. And I know I'm kind of jumping ahead here. Yep, so here's our release running to repackage the solution and push it into the next instance. So while that's going, let's look at this release here. So we have this release. This is just another pipeline. And what kicks this off is our build here. We're saying our pipeline demo project, our solution build, that was the name of our build pipeline. And we're giving our source an alias. So we're just saying, hey, anytime you have an artifact from our solution build, go ahead and run this release. And that can be seen here where we can, the little lightning bolt, this is where we can set up our continuous deployment. So I'm just saying include, our master. And we can do like build tags and all that stuff if you want to filter stuff. When you're doing releases, I would recommend you just pull a branch and call it releases / and then whatever you're going to call that release. And what that'll do is that will create a release folder for your all your release branches and keep them nicely together. But then you can set up your pipeline that any trigger on anything that's in that release folder it will run on. That way you're isolating the exact code that was being pushed in that release. So once that it detects that, it's going to automatically run. And in this case, so this is, again, this is the V1 UI versus the V2. We have our agent job, which is just setting up our VM that we're running on and timeout and artifact downloads, all that stuff. So this is the stuff that happens at the top of our YAML file that we had created previously. And then we're just going to say, hey, I need to run a PowerShell script. So we're going to run the process solution script and we're going to pass it in our connection string. This is a variable that is under the variables folder. And you can set up the library in here. You can set up all of your connection strings in there if you wanted to, and then call that from your pipeline. Or in this case, I did it just as a pipeline variable because this is the only place that this is being used. And if you notice, it is secured. So if I actually click on this lock, it will wipe out the value. The value is only visible when you put it in, unless you specify to leave it unlocked. So this is how it's connecting to Dynamics. And like I said, it's just a standard Office 365 authentication connection string. So we pass that in, and then you can set up what happens if it errors and all that. Let's see if our pipeline is done. Okay, it's still running. This always seems to be the part that takes the longest, is just pushing it back into the instance. But what we can see is that this one kicked off because it has a build artifact. And the nice thing is these build artifacts, you can set retention plans for them. So you can actually keep the artifact so you know what was exactly in there. And if I click on the actual build number here, it takes me right to the pipeline that built that artifact. And then over here, we have our initialize. So this is it just setting things up. And like I said, there are, out of the box, you do get variables and all that. And that's where these are all getting set up. So these are all different variables you can have and all that. This is all getting set up automatically by the system. And now it goes and it's going to download that artifact. So that artifact, we had told it is the release. And then here's the files, and it's copying it to a directory for our underscore build CDS modifications. So it's going to download everything that was in that release, so it knows what it's going to work with. And then after that, it's going to run the PowerShell script, which is done. Now, one thing I want to note in here, remember I had said when we looked at the variable that there was, it was a secure string. So it was only visible when I put it in. If you notice in here, I'm going to point this out now and we'll see it when I show you the PowerShell scripts. We can see the command that it's running. So it's running the PowerShell script, and there's our variable that we're passing in. But if you notice, it's all asterisks right here. That's because it's a secured connection string. So even in the log, it doesn't put it out. And even to show that even further, right here on line 13, it's all asterisks because I do a write host on the connection string. So that way I make sure it's secured. And it actually helped because I was, when you do the connection strings, a gotcha moment that I had is you would think because you're putting in a string that has, no spaces in it, you don't need the double quotation marks typically when you're storing it like in, like say, Azure Key Vault or somewhere. But the problem was, so this was seeing auth type equals Office 365, and that was it. It was cutting off everything else, and it was because I didn't include the double quotes when I put the variable in. As soon as I did that, it secured it. And then we can see it going down. It's running against that release. It's installing the tools it needs. We can see it connected to the Dynamics instance. It's processing the changes. It's checking the folder. I have a check in there to make sure the directory exists, and it does. And then it's going to go ahead and it's going to pack up our solution. And then it's going to push it into the Dynamics instance. So this has gone ahead and run successfully. So now if I come back and refresh, we should see the version number update. There we go. We have our version number, which is today's date, period, and then 1. And you can change that. If you have your own way that you want to do versioning and stuff like that, you have control over that. This is just if you use the build.build number that comes with Azure Pipelines, this is just the default that comes with it. So, like I said, this is, that whole solution move just started by me running one PowerShell script, and then I let the system handle it. I don't have to hit a button to export, wait for it to download, hit another button, log into the other instance, hit it, navigate over to settings, hit the import button. We can let it all happen. And one thing I haven't come across, so I haven't built it out yet, but if you notice, the version number we updated, that was just updating an XML file. So we could actually create an XML file, or you could probably even create a JSON file. We have some solutions, in systems that are larger where maybe you have a base solution and that has to be imported before any other solution that we create. You can create a configuration file to set it up, in the order that you want solutions to come in. And then we can read that file through a PowerShell script and import those solutions in the correct order. That's something, like I said, I haven't run into that yet since I started using pipelines, but that is on my plate to actually build out that. You can also, the tools that I had mentioned, you can use those to specify every single solution in what order, but on large enterprise implementations, like on that Microsoft engagement, that wouldn't have worked. I mean, we were like 50 solutions deep, and we were still adding on because they're on a 2-year project. So that would have became a pain in the butt to try to manage. So now that we've kind of seen the process kind of go through beginning to end, let's go back over and look at what the actual scripts are doing. So our D365 script, the one that gave us the pop-up that kind of kicked everything off, what we're doing in this one is from the beginning, all we're doing is installing the modules that we need. That's all we're doing. That's all this does is just sets up all the DLLs, all the scripts, everything that this is going to need. And then we're going to come down here, and this is actually where we're going to connect to CRM. And the reason I get a pop-up on this one is because of our interactive mode. and that's just tells it, hey, prompt, so the person has to log in. So once we get that, let's just go ahead and check and make sure that we're connected. And then we do a write host to output and say, hey, you're connected to, and here's the organization friendly name that you're connected to. This is kind of a check to make sure the user connected to the instance that they wanted to, because we don't want to, accidentally connect to prod, and then prod, all of a sudden you're downloading a solution from prod just to re-import back. So this will just output and say, hey, you're connected here. We're going to set up that zip folder location, and that's that download folder that I said is not being checked in for our pipeline demo.zip. We're going to go ahead and get that, make sure that directory exists. Because if you notice at the beginning, we didn't have a solutions folder. We didn't have a download folder. We didn't have any of that. So it automatically sets that up and then sets a variable to that location. And then this is where that pop-up that came up for me to pick the solution. This is where we pop in our fetch XML and we tell it, hey, I want a solution that's not created by the system and that is unmanaged, because we're dealing with dev, so it's going to be an unmanaged solution. So it's going to run this and it's going to give me all of the solutions. And then right here, this one line here is what outputs that. So we're going to say, hey, choose the solutions that you want to pull in. So we're going to do that. We're going to click OK. And if you click cancel, the script just ends. But so now we're going to go, for every single solution that I've chosen, we're going to do this. I set up a clean name, which is the solutions friendly name. And we're replacing, I forget what the /w does, but we're going to go ahead and replace that with just, we're going to bring everything together. Then we're going to say, hey, we're downloading this solution, so just stand by, don't do anything. So it's going to download it, and it's going to set up the zip file, so the pipeline demo.zip. We're going to set up the name. We're going to set up that, hey, we're going to put it in this downloaded folder as that zip file. And then we're going to extract that file. So now we've set up all the variables we need. And right here, this export, this is where we specify we're going to go ahead and export that solution. So we're downloading it, and then we're going to start unpacking it. So this next line, this is where we actually extract the file or the solution. And then we're just going to say, hey, I unpacked it. And then if there's another one, we're just going to go back and we're going to keep going until we go through all of them. When we're done, we're just going to tell the user, hey, I'm all done. Make sure you check in. And that's where we come over here and we write our quick little message and we go ahead and check in. So that's all this script does. And I have another one, I think I have it in my examples, where once we get the solutions, it'll actually ask you what configuration data. So if you have like what I would call a lookup entity, where like say a list of countries, that entity is not going to probably change a whole lot, and you want that data to be the same from instance to instance, or maybe a languages entity or whatever. That's what I can consider the configuration data. Also portals. That Microsoft engagement, we had 4 portals on that engagement. We had a portal for every single instance. And so we would have to move those configuration files from instance to instance to instance. And I don't know if anybody's ever done that before, but that can kind of be a pain in the butt. Luckily, there is a tool in XRM Toolbox. That was the tool I would use to move those until I discovered how to do it with PowerShell and all that. So let's go into the examples here. So the portal backup. Again, this is just another pipeline. And all this does is this is going to grab all of our portal files and it's just going to bring them into source control. So normally when I'm doing a PowerPortal, I like to work in VS Code for doing any JavaScript and HTML rather than directly in the record in Dynamics, just because I like the formatting and everything and the colorization. So I'll create, like if I'm working on a web template, I'll create a web template folder in here and I'll put the file in there. So I know exactly what I've updated, but I still want to grab all those configuration records and pull them down. So that's what this pipeline does. So when I check in that web template change, it'll kick off the pipeline automatically to go to CRM and grab everything and just pull it into source control, or I can just run the pipeline manually. So we have our same thing with our triggers and our pull, except now we're going to use that Power Dev Tools. To use it, we need to first install the Power Dev Tools that it's going to need. Then we're going to set up our script like we did before. And then we're going to do a copy files. This copy files, you need to what this is doing is it's taking our source directory backup folder and it's copying it to our build directory. Otherwise, the remainder items won't work. Once you've copied over those files, we're going to connect to CRM. And I'm providing it a portal.xml file. And that file you can actually get directly from Microsoft. I'm going to put this in the chat for everybody. You will want to make a tweak to it. There's no filtering on it, but if you're familiar with the Common Data Service configuration migration, it's really easy to use that. And this comes in the SDK to modify the XML file to include filtering. The one that I typically change is the notes. There's no filter on the notes part, which are how web files are stored. So if you don't have a filter on that, you're going to download every single note in the system. When I don't care about I only want the ones that are linked to a web file. But you just click on the link and it will download the XML for you. Just open up a notepad here. So this is what you get from Microsoft. So this is what the pipeline is going to use to know what data to go get. So it's going to go get all of that, and it's going to place it. Now, a gotcha that I had, and this hung me up for a little while when I was first learning these, is your configuration data, the zip file must be called data.zip. So if you're dealing with multiple configuration data, you want to have them like in this backup folder. I would have a folder for each of the entities that I would have, and each one of those would have a data.zip in them. So we're going to go ahead and export our data, and then we're going to go ahead and we can extract it just like we did the solution. So now we have the raw XML and everything. We have the actual data, and we have the scripts to map up that data. And then again, this one we're going to set a version number. So this one, using the tools, we can actually set the version number on the solution before we even export it out of dev. So we're going to set that up, and then we're going to export our solution, and then we're going to extract it, and then we're going to check everything in. This one, if you notice, there is no reference to PowerShell scripts in this one at all, because we are using, that's what this one was set up for. So this is if you don't know PowerShell, and you can come in here. And so the MSCRM tools installer. So if I click on settings, it's going to bring this up, the Power DevOps tool installer. But how did I get it in here? So to get it in here, you have all of these tasks here. So all I do is click on a line, and I can come in here and search tasks and just say tool install. And if I look here, here's our Power DevOps tool installer. So if I just click on it, it brings it up with, okay, what do I need to fill out? And I can click add, and it just automatically adds it in to our YAML file. And that's the same thing on all these. You just click settings, and here's this. But here's our export. So we're passing in our connection string, which again is a variable. Here's the schema file for it to use, and then here's the data file to put the data in. And again, it's just, it makes it so you don't have to write code. So you could, even if you're not a developer and know PowerShell and all that, you can still come in here and you can still set up to do all of your deployments the same way. You can still come in and set everything up, set up each solution individually, set up the orders. It's just going to make the YAML file longer because I believe you can do some looping in YAML, but I haven't done it yet. So even if you're not a developer, you can set this stuff up. So with PowerShell, though, to push our configuration data into the next instance, I set up a PowerShell script that takes the connection string, and there's this update build. This is a flag that I use, but we passed in our connection string, set up all our tools and everything. And this is the cool part. This one, I'm really proud of myself for figuring this out, is using Git diff. So what this does is it looks to see everything that's in that commit and checks to see everything that's changed. And we go ahead and we loop over everything. Now, when you do that, it's going to show every single file that was changed. Well, we don't care about the specific files because we're going to build the solution. So since the solution is essentially a directory name because it's unpacked, we're going to loop over that and we're going to check our configuration data. Well, in this case, the configuration data. We're going to loop over and we're going to check and see if we're working in the configuration data folder. And if we are, we're going to make sure that we haven't added that to our array. So in this case, like the portal, if we had a portal folder, say we had portal and it had the data.zip in it, we would see a portal and we would see portal/data.zip in here. So the first time this runs, it's going to be the portal. Okay, I'm going to add that to my array. And then when it sees the change for the data.zip one, we're going to say, well, we've already added portal into our array, so I'm just going to ignore this because all I care about is that folder level. So once it goes through that, it's going to log into CRM. And if you notice, the interactive flag is not there any longer. That's because we have no interaction that we need to do. So it's going to go ahead and automatically connect, and then it's going to start looping over our configuration data. And it does account for, so if I come in here and I delete this solutions folder, that's obviously a change that's going to kick off the pipeline. I've accounted for that in my scripts to where it's going to test the path. Does this path actually exist? If it doesn't exist, oh, okay. So this was a delete. There's nothing I need to do with Dynamics. So I'm just going to skip and move on to the next one. And it's going to take that zip file as it goes down. We're going to set up our zip locations and variables we need. And this one line right here is what pushes that configuration data into the CRM instance. And then after that, they've changed it now. You can do a verbose on this and output the log. But previously when I wrote this, you couldn't. So I was getting the log and outputting the log directly into that console that we had seen. And then I go ahead and delete the log because we don't need it, because that's all happening on a VM. So this is just real quick, how we go ahead and get CRM data. And then I had mentioned previously when we had downloaded the solution, this is the same thing, but what this for that solution, but when we get down to line 90 and stuff here, this one here, we're setting up, if you want to ask the user what configuration data they want, we're going to set that up, and then we're going to ask them, when I had set this up, I had a folder in there that was configuration data and had all the XMLs that you would use, and it would show that to the user, and you pick, okay, I need to move this configuration data. And then it's going to go through and loop over those. And this is how we export configuration data from Dynamics to bring it into source control locally. And I did want to show on the release, one thing you can do, because I had mentioned on the release pipeline, you can set up approvals. And in there, I don't have it set up on this one, but I actually do have it live on a client right now. Edit. We can come in here and there's these pre-deployment conditions. If we click on the little person here, we have our triggers, but if we come down here, we have our pre-deployment approvals. If you enable this, you can put in a list of people that need to approve. So like on the Microsoft engagement, when we went from dev to test, there was no approval. It just went to test. But to go from test to UAT, there were 3 people that had to approve the deployment. And then to go from UAT to production, there was about 6 people that had to approve it. So you can set this up in between each of your areas with a list of people, and they're getting an email and they just click a button on it and it brings them in, and then they just say, yes, I approve this, or no. You can also set a timeout. So if somebody doesn't approve it, rather than have this just sitting here forever, you can say, hey, after 7 days, if this isn't approved, let's just go ahead and kill this release. And then that won't stop any releases after it. It just stops that one release. So this being, I think we were on release 9, it won't stop release 10, 11, 12, 13. It'll just stop this release from being pushed into the next instance. So that is just like kind of real high level. I kind of wanted to keep this a little bit of an introduction into pipelines. I know there was a lot between the PowerShell and the tools, but the more and more, you know, just like most things, the more and more you do something, the more comfortable you get with it and everything. And like I said, I will be, you know, putting up some of this code on my blog and everything for anybody that's interested in it. But just to recap, we kind of, you know, went over the pipelines, the differences between a build. You know, we set up our artifacts and everything, and prep it and test it and get it ready for the release. How we can use Git to push our files back into our repo. You know, how we can use PowerShell. As a developer, I tend to like the PowerShell one a little bit more because, you know, developers, we like control. So it gives me all of the control over what's happening versus using, you know, a tool. But the Power DevOps tools, I mean, has worked great. There was some caveats with it, but it is on Git, and they're the community. I know the one issue I ran into, I got feedback really quick and was able to fix it through the, you know, by opening an issue on Git for it. So any questions? I know I went pretty quick. That was a ton of information just to dump in about an hour.
Hey James, I got a quick question here. I'm not a developer, and so I was wondering, what is, aside from being able to manage the portals and that kind of stuff, what would be the difference or benefits of going this method versus using the Power Platform build tools in pipelines?
Well, that's what the Power Platform build tools in the pipelines, you can also use those. That's what the DevOps tools that I showed is basically like the same thing. That was actually out before the build, the CDS build pipelines. And I know they just added the client ID and secret to those. Because when I first looked at these, I came across both. And the one from Microsoft only allowed you to connect with a named user, which obviously won't work with MFA and everything. And I prefer to not use a named user for any like system integrations and stuff. I prefer to use a client ID and a secret, which when I was researching for this one, it looks like they have updated that to use a client ID and secret now. So you can use either one. They're very, very, very similar in how they're set up and what you can do with them. Let's see if I can find it real quick in here, because I know I did install it. Yeah, this is what you're talking about, the Power, this one's the Power Apps check, whoops, wrong one. But I do have both of them installed on here. Any other questions?
So maybe you already answered this, but how long did this take you to get all set up?
The very, very, very first pipeline I ever did took me about 2 weeks, but that was a lot of researching into stuff that I had never done before with Git and all that stuff. But now, like when I set this up for this demo, I spun up the demo, brought over the pipeline, set up the repo and everything in probably 2 to 3 hours. Because a lot of the stuff, you know, once you kind of get these scripts, you can kind of just tweak them client to client and stuff. So just like most things, I'm getting faster at doing PowerPortals. I'm getting faster at doing pipelines.
Right. Cool.